And sometimes it starts at the beginning of the song, and sometimes it starts at the end. Welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. I am Pastor Megan, and I am in San Francisco, the Executive Director of Welcome. And over here is Pastor Amanda Zenz-Arlo, who is currently in Washington, but soon to be in Portland, Oregon. We are both Lutheran pastors, and we have been away for 2 weeks. Sorry about that. But part of the reason that we are away is because I was working on a Bible Study That Doesn't Suck mobile app, which is currently available at Android Play. That's what it's called, right, for Android people? And soon to be available on iTunes. Probably be available in the next 3 days, depending upon when you listen to this. Maybe that was before. Who knows? Today is a Tuesday, so don't forget about it based on that. We'll let you know on our Facebook space. If you want to go to the Bible Study That Doesn't Suck page on Facebook, you can get updates there. Haha, shameless plug. You had to listen to it. So just know that we're working on cool stuff. The app, even if it sucks right now, we hope to work on it and make it a little bit better. Not all of the things that we do on our Bible Study That Doesn't Suck will work on Android phones and on iPhones, so it will take us a little time to kind of update our material to make sure that it works for there, but, download the app now so that you can avoid the rush. But, so you don't forget. That's maybe a good reason to do it. Yes. And we're both feeling very funny tonight. Whenever we do our Bible studies in the evening, you can always tell because we get a little loopy. But loopy, hopefully, in a good way. The text today is the story of Mary and Martha, at least in the gospel text from Luke. Amanda's laughing a little bit because earlier I did the wrong lectionary text, so this is take 2 for this week because I tried to talk about the Good Samaritan. The gospel text is really, really short this week. It's just a little bit about Mary and Martha, and depending upon which gospel text you read, you'll find that Jesus has either a very quick relationship with Mary and Martha, or a very long, deep, chosen family sort of relationship with Mary and Martha. Amanda's going to look this up if we don't know off the top of our heads, but there's one Bible text that talks about the resurrection of Lazarus. I want to say that it's in the Gospel of Luke, but I'm not absolutely certain about that, so Amanda's going to let us know. It's in John. Fantastic. So John is the text that goes really deeply in depth into the story of Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. The other texts don't really talk about Lazarus that much at all. It's really only in the Gospel of John. And if you think about the way that the texts are written, if it's true, as historians currently believe, that Mark was written first, there's a bunch of Marys in the Gospel of Mark, and we don't know which Mary, the sister of Martha, is. So it's possible that she gets a shout out in some of the other texts, but we just don't know it because we don't know which Mary, the sister of Martha, is. But it doesn't appear that she is in Mark's Gospel unless she is the woman who washes Jesus' feet, who is unnamed in that book. It's possible that it's the same person. We don't know. There's stories of Mary taking care of Jesus and having good hospitality, but they come in later books. So we don't know if it's unnamed women who get kind of grouped together because they're not sure who's who in the story, because unfortunately probably male authors weren't keeping good track of the names of the women or remembering them, or we're grouping their stories together. We're not entirely sure. And so if Matthew and Luke kind of come out around the same time, but with different ideas about how they want to tell the story of Jesus, Matthew's very interested in showing what a good Jewish man Jesus is, and talking about Jesus' story being very similar to that of Moses. That story has less of Mary and Martha. Luke's story, however, is one that kind of starts off in a very patriarchal way. It starts with the genealogy of Jesus that says Jesus is the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son. and makes you think it's going to be a very patriarchal text, but then kind of continues to only let the women talk. There's very long soliloquies by Elizabeth and by Mary, and their husbands, Zechariah and Joseph, are silenced during the entire kind of birthing story of Jesus and John the Baptist. And so it kind of continues to be a story that uplifts women. So you'd think if there was going to be a story that would get the names of the ladies right, it might be Luke's gospel, but it's hard to know because it happens later. And the later you tell the story from the event, kind of the more details you kind of remember. If you ever try to tell your childhood stories, the older you get, sometimes the details get fuzzy. And then John's gospel is kind of more of a Gnostic text. It's more interested in helping you remember the right answers, with this idea that if you know the right thing to say, that you can become enlightened. Or some people think that if you know the magic words, you can get into heaven. Like if there's a password to get into heaven, you can memorize those words in the book of John. Much of the way that our contemporary worship is set up is to memorize those things that John thinks is important. So John's very late story that is much more poetic and much more interested in you knowing the right things, maybe a bit fudgy on the historical details about how Jesus is born. If it ruins your faith to think that one of the gospel writers might have fudged the details, then that probably didn't happen at all. If it doesn't ruin your faith, then probably John was a bit fudgy with the details. So John is the text that has the most about Mary, Martha, and Luke, or Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and the most we know about that story. But what we have in this Luke text is just a tiny little snippet. And it kind of is more about reminding us that you should pay attention to God's time. There's lots of parables about this in Mark's gospel, and it's the parable of the fig tree would be the parable that probably most correctly corresponds with the lesson that's in this text, because Martha's keeping herself very busy, which is what you would think would be the good thing to do, right? Get all of your work done, particularly in the traditional Jewish understanding about how you are a hospitable person would be to kind of take care of people's physical needs. Martha is being the best host in terms of kind of doing the work of the house and getting the food prepared and making sure that your guests have everything that they need. So she's following the hospitality laws that were written into kind of ancient Judaism that you really should follow. And yet Jesus is saying that Mary is doing the thing that is the most pleasing, which is paying attention to God when God shows up in your house. The reason this is connected to the fig tree is the fig tree doesn't produce fruit when Jesus is hungry, so the fig tree is out of sync with God and isn't meeting the needs of God. And so there's kind of this connection that says it's less important to follow all of the rules of Judaism and more important to be in sync with God and to have this new kind of hospitality, particularly because the text that precedes this in the Gospel of Luke is the Good Samaritan text, which says that you should be available for your neighbor, that you should take care of people and go, and this is the way to fulfill the law that says the Lord your God is the highest above and you should love your neighbor as yourself. So that's kind of a long-winded way of connecting you to what this really short text is up to. Remember that we have to work really hard, particularly as Lutherans, not to be anti-Semitic in the ways that we're talking about the biblical text. Anti-Semitic is a word that means kind of anti-Jewish. It's the stuff that like Hitler did. He took some of Luther's writings when he was really mad at the Jewish folk because they didn't agree with him at the end of his life, and he wrote really angry stuff. Previous to that in his life, he was very much in cooperation with the local Jewish groups around him. But we have to be really paying attention when Jesus is giving us a text that says, you don't have to do any of that stuff that ancient Jewish folks say is really good to follow. That we're not being condescending to other faiths, that we're not saying, all those things you do are really unnecessary because Jesus came and ha ha ha, we don't have to do that anymore. So we want to make sure that that's not the way we talk about these texts, but that we're thinking about the ways that Jesus kind of frees us from some of the rules and the obligations that we feel that we have to each other, invites us to connect with each other in a new way, and kind of extends that promise. It doesn't say, hey, you, everyone else is bad, because that kind of misses the point of hospitality and syncing with what's up and what God is doing in the world. So I'll pause right there. We'll talk about some of the other text as well, but I want to give Amanda a chance to talk a little bit about this Luke text. What do you think, Amanda?
Well, I think it's really interesting that we have this hospitality text paired up right after the Good Samaritan text. So for those of you out there who are watching who are not lifelong Christians, there are those of us who don't grow up with these texts and we don't know what these shorthand things mean. So a quick brief piece just for those who, like me, didn't grow up knowing what that meant, Good Samaritan text. So what that text is there's a man who's traveling on the road and he gets jumped, he gets beat up by robbers, and he's left on the side of the road having been beaten to a pulp and had everything stolen from him. And along the road comes, and Jesus tells this story as an answer to a question, and along the road comes people that you would typically expect in hearing a story, those who would actually help this poor person who's been hurt by this situation. So you have a religious leader, a pastor who comes along, you have a wealthy person who comes along, and they don't do anything. They cross to the other side of the road and keep walking and avoid getting involved in this situation of this person who's been robbed. And then along comes a Samaritan at the time of Jesus was a person who believed the opposite. So if you are a staunch Democrat, this could be a Republican in our overly divided political world right now. If you are an extreme liberal, this could be the extreme conservative. Whatever it is that you polarize in your world, then the Samaritan stands for the people that you don't associate with. And so the Samaritan comes along, and everybody who's listening to this story is supposed to go, boo, hiss, the Samaritan's not going to do anything. And instead it's the Samaritan who goes and picks this person up and puts him on his carriage, takes him and makes certain that he gets medical attention, puts him in a hotel, pays for the hotel while he's healing and recovering, and comes back and pays for that. So it's Jesus' way of saying, look, don't make assumptions about who your neighbor is. Don't make assumptions. And we're not just called to talk about our faith. We're called to do something about our faith. We're called to live the faith that we are preaching. And if the person living the faith that we're preaching doesn't look like us, talk like us, or agree with us, that doesn't mean that they aren't living the faith too. It just means that maybe we're drawing our circles too small. And whenever we draw our circles to create an us and a them, Jesus steps over that line and looks back at us and says, so who's the them, right? And that's what that parable is about. So we have that story, and immediately following, we have this section with Mary and Martha, and Jesus coming in to stay with Mary and Martha. Now, it would be very normal for Jesus to come, and when he arrived in places, to stay with people who had wealth. And these Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, as we hear from the Gospel of John, again, we might be woodgy on the details, but our understanding of who Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are is that they live in Bethany, the place of God, and they have enough financial ability to be able to welcome in these travelers and feed them all. So The hospitality rules are really, really, really important. It's more important for you to be hospitable to a stranger than it is to feed your own family. And that's not something that we as Americans, I don't think we understand what that means. I think that if a stranger showed up at our door, we would look at them and most of us would close our door and say, I'm sorry, I don't know you, I'm not going to take you in. But at the time, a stranger walked up to your door and knocked on it. And not only did you have to take them in, you had to feed them the best meal that you could prepare, make certain they had the best place to sleep, and give them everything they needed to be well. Hospitality was crucial to the faith of the Jewish people. And it was crucial to their understanding not just of what you should do in life, but how you should be as a person of faith. This was not just a, you should do this. It's a, this is who you are as a child of God. You extend hospitality as a child of God. So it's when Jesus and the crew show up at Mary and Martha's, what Martha is doing here is living out her faith as a child of God as best she can. And we've just heard a parable that tells us to do everything, like to actually do what we're told, to live our faith. And so she's doing what she can. And Mary is sitting and learning. And Martha, like many of us who get tired and who serve and who work, gets angry. And does two pieces here. Instead of just extending the hospitality, she gets bitter about having to extend it. And she comes out and says, Lord, don't you care that my sister isn't doing anything for you? Like a little bit of a tattletale, like she's not living her faith, and we're supposed to live our faith, and she's not doing it, and I'm doing all the work. Tell her to get up and tell her to help me. And Mary, exactly as Megan has typed in the side here, Mary has done this radical act of choosing to sit and listen at the feet of the rabbi, rather than going and doing the work that a woman is supposed to be doing, especially a woman of Jewish faith who should be preparing the meal to show hospitality to the guest. And Mary instead has chosen the man's role of sitting at the rabbi's feet and learning the lessons that there are to be learned. So how do we reconcile this with what we've just learned from Good Samaritan, from this week of do things and don't just live your life, but actually live what the faith is telling us to do, and this kind of juxtaposition of Mary and Martha. So I think that a lot of the commentaries I looked at before we started, and a couple things are kind of focusing on this one little piece in verse 42. There is need of only one thing, and kind of focusing on that, which is an interesting take, to kind of boil this down to say, Jesus responds to Martha by saying, you're worried and distracted by many things, and there is need of only one thing. And I think that to us in our current society, we get very distracted. We get very caught up in doing. We get very caught up in making certain that we are what people expect us to be, and that we are who people expect us to be. And we can get caught in that and not take the time for the one thing, which is learning from Jesus and being present in the moment. I think many of us get so caught in planning for the next thing that we would walk right by the guy on the side of the road because we've got somewhere to be, just like the priest does in the Good Samaritan. And Martha absolutely has a meal to prepare and a bed to make and maybe people to rearrange in the household to make sure people can sleep. But there are times in life when Jesus is teaching, when you're supposed to be present, the one thing that we have to do is stop and breathe and be present in that moment. And that is what matters. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that we can do the Bible study that doesn't suck without at least bringing up the giant amount of news that has happened in this last week. and I don't think that we can address in this Bible study the Good Samaritan and this Mary and Martha text without talking a little bit about the Trayvon Martin case.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, I read a brilliant article today, 2 articles, the one blog post linked back to the other. One was an absolutely brilliant, articulate reflection from a gentleman of color talking about how brokenhearted he is at the outcome of this and what his hopes had been for this case, and the heartbreak of it not turning out, the heartbreak of it feeling very much like racism has been okayed. And then another blog post from a white, middle-aged male Lutheran pastor who said, we need to be very careful of how we talk as pastors and as people of privilege, because to share our outrage and, oh, you're right, from our white liberal privilege, for those of us like myself who actually don't find ourselves in that much of a minority, how we speak back when in reality I am that priest walking by the Good Samaritan, not the Samaritan who's stopping to help the one who's been beat up. In my place of privilege, I am the Martha who has the ability to go and to do and to be providing a meal. I'm not the person coming to the door and asking for hospitality. And to be very careful how we, who are in more of a majority than others, begin to speak, and particularly those of us who are speaking in pulpits have to be very conscious and responsible and respectful at this time. And perhaps the only one thing that we really need to be doing right now, as those of us who are in places of privilege, is to shut up and listen. To stop talking, to sit at the feet and listen to those who have something to teach us. We don't need to necessarily be the ones saying, oh, well, we should go to the picket lines and we should do, yes, you can. But more important is to shut up and go find someone who's hurting, who's just been told that it's okay that their son was killed, and listen to their grief, and be present and be Mary in that situation. And so those are some of the pieces. I am not preaching this week. I am on vacation, so this is kind of the stuff that's been battling around in my head and bumping around in my head as I've been praying through and reacting with people of God around what has occurred in social actions across our country, because also in these 2 weeks we've had several things in Supreme Court cases and other events that have occurred that I think for us in this audience have something to say. And so whether we're talking about equality, racial equality, or whether we're talking about sexual equality, or whether we're talking about other pieces, those of us who are in places of privilege, we really have to watch ourselves. And being an advocate and being an ally sometimes is learning that we don't have the answers and our voice is not the most important. So having said all of that and having talked for a very long time, my turn to shut up.